Eleanor Atherton laughed when Drake Sullivan, a single father in a scuffed work jacket, set a deposit check on the table and asked to buy her private jet. In front of a room full of investors, she called him a broke dreamer and had security walk him out of the hangar before he finished his sentence. Less than 1 hour later, every alarm inside Atherton Air turned red. 3 jets lost sensor synchronization at once. 2 flights were forced to turn back mid-route, and the strange error code flashing across every screen belonged to a warning system only one man in the building had ever built. That man was already driving away when the phone started ringing. Before the full story unfolds, hit subscribe. So this reversal lands the moment the powerful assume they've already won for good. Before dawn the following morning had even broken, the private hangar belonging to the Atherton family was already filling with investors, executives, and champagne glasses that caught the light from a brand new $60 million jet parked at the center of the floor. At the far end of the same hangar sat an older aircraft, the Orion 900, the very jet Eleanor herself had flown for nearly a decade and was now quietly preparing to sell. It had served as more than a private plane over the years. Buried inside its avionics bay was a prototype diagnostic system that had once been the pride of an engineer nobody in that room remembered by name. Drake Sullivan walked through the glass doors wearing a jacket stained with engine grease, work boots that had seen better winters, and a battered leather case tucked under one arm. His presence landed in that polished crowd like a wrench dropped on marble. A receptionist assumed he had come to fix something. When he explained instead that he had an appointment to discuss purchasing the Orion 900, a ripple of laughter moved through the nearest cluster of guests before he even reached the reception desk. Preston Vance, the company's chief operating officer, made a point of letting Drake stand in the middle of the crowd rather than showing him to a private office, turning him into a spectacle suited Preston's purposes better than privacy ever could. Preston had recognized the name the moment it appeared on the visitor list, since Drake was the same engineer who had once sent repeated written warnings about the safety architecture now humming quietly through most of the fleet. When Eleanor finally crossed the floor to meet him, she asked what he did for a living. Upon hearing that he ran a small independent repair shop on the edge of town, she glanced through the window at his aging pickup truck and asked loud enough for nearby guests to hear whether he could even afford the hangar parking fee. Drake did not flinch at the laughter that followed. He simply placed a $50,000 deposit check on the table beside a sealed letter of financial verification and offered $2. $4 million for the aircraft, a figure that matched its technical valuation exactly but fell well short of the number Eleanor had hoped to attach to anything bearing the family name. She never opened the letter. To her, looking at him had already answered every question she needed answered, and that certainty would prove to be the first mistake of a very long day. Photographers hired for the unveiling drifted toward the two of them without quite meaning to, sensing that something more interesting than a new jet had just walked through the door. Their cameras clicked at exactly the moment Eleanor's smile hardened into something closer to a performance. A junior analyst near the bar leaned toward a colleague and whispered a joke about repossession trucks loud enough that Drake clearly heard it, though he gave no sign that the words had landed anywhere at all. Eleanor straightened the cuff of her jacket, glanced once more at the deposit check as though it might dissolve if she looked away, and folded her arms in a way that told everyone watching exactly how this conversation was going to end. Somewhere behind her, Preston had already begun murmuring into a colleague's ear, setting the tone for how the rest of the staff would treat the stranger for however long he remained in the building. Eleanor asked with the practiced patience of someone humoring a child, why a man who appeared to be scraping by would want to own a private aircraft in the first place. Drake answered that he had no interest in leather interiors, an onboard bar, or the family crest painted along the fuselage. All he wanted was the aircraft delivered exactly as it stood, with the experimental electronics bay in the tail section left completely untouched. That single sentence made Preston's posture change in a way nobody else in the room noticed. Eleanor, however, heard something else entirely in his words, convincing herself that this stranger intended to strip the plane for parts and resell its components, turning a piece of Atherton history into scrap. In front of the board and 2 reporters who had been invited to cover the new jet unveiling, she told him he had likely confused a private aircraft auction with a used car lot. Preston added to more laughter that perhaps a toy model would suit his budget better. Drake did not argue. He only asked her to read the financial documents before making her decision. When she tore the envelope open without so much as glancing at the contents, tossing it back across the table and declaring that Atherton Air did not sell assets to people who might embarrass the brand, he asked whether she was certain she wanted that particular sentence captured on camera. She told him without a trace of doubt that she was. Security escorted him toward the exit while the crowd returned to its champagne and its new jet. And Marlene Torres, the airline's chief pilot and head of flight operations, watched the entire exchange from near the coffee station with a frown that deepened the longer it went on. She recognized the name Sullivan from years earlier, back when the two of them had worked adjacent programs, and she remembered him as anything but an ordinary mechanic. When she started to step forward, Preston quietly blocked her path, insisting that Drake had left the company years ago because he could not manage his temper. A claim Marlene found strange given the calm, almost bored way the man in the doorway was accepting his public humiliation. Years earlier, before the grease-stained jacket and the aging pickup truck, Drake had spent a decade inside a much larger aerospace company, rising to lead a team that designed the very safety architecture now quietly protecting thousands of passengers every single day. When his wife passed away, he had walked away from that career almost overnight, choosing instead to raise his daughter on his own terms, running a small repair shop where he could set his own hours and never miss a school recital or a doctor's appointment again. The decision had cost him nearly everything on paper, draining his savings into equipment loans and a prolonged legal dispute over ownership of his own earlier inventions. But it had never once cost him the quiet certainty that he had made the right choice for his family. None of that history showed on his face as he crossed the hangar floor that morning, and none of it would have mattered to anyone watching him leave, since to them he was simply a stranger in the wrong kind of jacket. On his way out, Drake paused beside a maintenance display screen bolted to the hangar wall and watched 3 error codes flicker briefly across it before the system wiped them automatically, a detail that made him stop walking entirely. He warned the nearest technician not to authorize engine startup on any aircraft until someone checked the central diagnostic module. Preston, following a few steps behind, told him flatly that his opinion carried no weight anymore since he no longer worked for the airline. Drake walked out to his truck without another word. But as he reached for the door handle, he glanced toward the runway and saw an Atherton Airjet lifting off into the grey morning sky. In the cockpit of that very aircraft, the same error code had just begun to blink. Part 2, the crisis. Less than an hour after Drake had been walked out of the building, the airline's Central Operations Center lit up with alerts from 3 separate flights in the space of a few minutes. Pilots reported that their altitude and airspeed sensors were feeding inconsistent numbers to the cockpit displays. Although the backup systems were holding for the moment, standard safety procedure forced 2 of the aircraft to divert to the nearest available airports. A third flight, already lined up for a transatlantic departure, was pulled from the runway entirely after onboard computers flagged a mismatch between 3 separate sensor arrays feeding the same readout. Within 20 minutes, the board inside the operations center had shifted entirely from a calm amber to a blinking, insistent red. Eleanor, still mingling near the new jet, was interrupted mid-sentence by Marlene, who told her flatly that the celebration needed to end and the emergency board needed to convene immediately. Preston tried to minimize the situation, calling it a display glitch and insisting there was no evidence connecting the incidents. But within another 20 minutes, 9 more aircraft had transmitted the exact same string of error codes, and the illusion of coincidence collapsed under its own weight. If the entire fleet had to be grounded, Atherton Air stood to lose tens of millions of dollars for every day it sat idle. Worse, the timing threatened to gut the company's valuation just weeks before its planned public offering. Eleanor demanded answers from her technical staff, but nobody in the room recognized the fault code because it belonged to an older diagnostic layer that had quietly been dropped from the company's official maintenance manuals years earlier. Marlene remembered exactly where she had seen that layer before, and she said Drake Sullivan's name out loud in front of the entire operations center, a suggestion Preston rejected immediately, arguing that a man they had just thrown out of the building had every motive to sabotage the system out of spite. Eleanor was inclined to believe Preston at first, ordering security to check whether Drake had come into contact with any aircraft during his brief visit. The footage confirmed he had never crossed the technical perimeter at all. Marlene pulled an old maintenance file bearing Drake's signature, a warning written months earlier that a discount batch of sensors could produce synchronized failures across multiple aircraft if they all received the same firmware update at once. That warning had been forwarded to Preston's desk 6 months prior and marked in his own handwriting as requiring no further action. Eleanor finally ordered someone to bring Drake back. Marlene reached him by phone 30 miles down the highway, where he listened to the unfolding crisis in silence before asking a single question. Had anyone checked on the Orion 900? Marlene told him the aircraft was being prepped to relocate to another airfield that very afternoon, and Drake's voice sharpened instantly as he told her to stop that process immediately, no matter what it took. Marlene gave the order to cut power to the Orion 900 before it could taxi anywhere, a decision that infuriated Preston, who accused her of overstepping her authority in front of the entire crisis team. Eleanor called Drake herself, and rather than apologize for anything that had happened that morning, she simply ordered him to return at once, as though nothing between them had changed. He reminded her calmly that he no longer worked for the company and owed her no obligation whatsoever. A response that visibly rattled her composure. Arthur Lockwood, chairman of the board, cut into the call and offered $100,000 if Drake could restore normal operations overnight. But Drake declined that offer just as easily as he had declined Eleanor's demand. Instead, he laid out 3 conditions before he would set foot back inside the hangar. Every aircraft carrying the suspect sensor batch had to be grounded immediately and without exception. Malene Torres needed full authority over safety decisions with no interference from Preston permitted at any level. Nobody was to delete, alter, or relocate a single byte of data stored aboard the Orion 900. Eleanor suspected he was using the crisis to settle a score and nearly refused outright, but a local news outlet had already begun reporting on the diverted flights, and Arthur made it clear she had no room left to negotiate. When Drake walked back through the hangar doors, nobody laughed this time. Several of the executives who had mocked him hours earlier suddenly found something urgent to look at on their phones. Preston still referred to him as the outside mechanic and insisted security keep him under close watch, but Drake paid the remark no attention and walked straight to the Orion 900, opening its avionics bay until he found a silver module that had clearly spent nearly a decade in that same compartment. Stamped along its edge in small, worn lettering were the words, D. Sullivan Prototype 01. Malene's expression shifted the instant she read it because she finally understood that the man standing in front of her had designed the very safety architecture the entire fleet now depended on. Eleanor went still. She had heard the name attached to that architecture, referenced in board meetings for years, always spoken with a kind of distant reverence, and never once suspected it belonged to the man in the grease-stained jacket she had personally ordered removed from her hangar that morning. Drake explained that the aircraft was never just a piece of personal property to him. It was the original testbed for the very sensor network now wired through nearly every jet the company owned. The raw data locked inside that module could reveal exactly which sensors had been altered and which aircraft remained in danger. When he tried to access the system, though, he found the most critical section of the archive locked behind an administrative key that traced directly back to Preston Vance. Drake turned to face him and asked in front of the entire operations team why a chief operating officer would lock down safety data on the very morning his airline had gone to full alert. The room had gone quiet enough that the hum of the hangar's ventilation system suddenly seemed loud. Every executive who had laughed that morning now stood frozen near the walls, unwilling to draw attention to themselves by moving. Eleanor's eyes moved between Drake and Preston as though she were watching a chess match she had only just realized she was losing. For the first time that day, her voice lost its polished edge entirely. Malene quietly signaled 2 of her senior technicians to start pulling backup logs from a secondary server, anticipating that whatever Preston said next would need to be checked against something he could not later alter. Preston claimed the lock existed to protect proprietary trade secrets, then pivoted quickly, accusing Drake of trying to steal back technology he had supposedly sold to the company years before. Drake corrected him without raising his voice, explaining that he had never sold outright ownership of the diagnostic core. His old company had only granted Atherton Air a conditional license to use it. That license, he added, contained a clause stating that if the airline knowingly ignored a high-priority safety warning, emergency access rights would automatically revert back to the original inventor. Eleanor assumed he was bluffing and ordered her legal team to verify the claim on the spot. Within minutes, the company's own attorney confirmed the clause was real, word for word. The first real reversal of the day landed hard in that moment. The man Eleanor had dismissed as penniless turned out to hold legal authority over the single most important technology keeping her fleet in the air. Drake got to work immediately, tracing the fault back to a software update pushed to the entire fleet 3 days earlier. One that made the newer sensors respond faster but threw them out of sync with the older backup systems whenever an aircraft changed altitude in cold air. Technicians confirmed that 14 aircraft had received the update, and 6 of those were currently airborne. Drake and Malene worked side by side, walking pilots through manual cross-check procedures meant to bypass the faulty synchronization. Although tension in the room climbed with every passing minute, not one crew lost control of their aircraft. Eleanor tried to reassert command by insisting the remaining flights continue on to their destinations rather than divert, worried that a wave of emergency landings would draw even more press attention than the diversions already had. Drake objected immediately, telling her plainly in front of the full operation staff that no stock offering was worth more than the safety of the people sitting in those cabins. She reminded him coldly that it was still her airline. He answered that her name might be painted on the fuselage, but once the cabin door closed, the lives inside no longer belonged to her. Malene backed him without hesitation and ordered every affected flight to land at the nearest suitable airport. After several tense seconds, Eleanor relented and let the order stand. Every aircraft touched down safely. For a moment, the room allowed itself to breathe. But Drake was already frowning at a deeper problem the crisis had exposed. A software update of that scale could not simply appear out of nowhere. It had to be approved using a high-level administrative credential, and only 3 people inside the company held that authority: Eleanor herself, Preston, and a former chief engineer who had left the company 2 months earlier. When Drake pulled the approval log, the digital signature attached to the update belonged unmistakably to Eleanor Atherton. Eleanor denied ever approving any such update, and Preston produced an email showing her signature on a document labeled Fleet Performance Optimization from a finance meeting 3 weeks prior. She recalled signing dozens of documents that day, most of them prepared by Preston himself, and insisted she had no idea a safety-critical update had been buried somewhere inside that stack of paperwork. Drake told her that not reading something did not erase her responsibility for what it authorized. As chief executive, she was accountable for whatever she allowed to happen under her name. Preston immediately tried to redirect the conversation, accusing Drake of orchestrating the entire crisis to force the airline into selling him the aircraft at a discount. He went further, producing financial records showing Drake's repair shop carried significant bank debt and his personal account sat nearly empty. In front of the assembled board, Preston asked how a man who could barely service his own loan expected anyone to believe he could pay $2.4 million for a private jet. Eleanor looked at Drake as though the missing piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place, convinced she had caught him in exactly the kind of scheme she had suspected from the start. Drake, without a hint of urgency, opened the leather case she had refused to look inside the day before and laid out a formal investment commitment from Pembroke Aerospace Capital, guaranteeing not only the full purchase price of the aircraft but an additional $18 million earmarked for a new testing facility. A junior board member near the back of the room quietly pulled up the Pembroke Aerospace Capital name on a tablet and turned pale within seconds, sliding the screen toward Arthur without a word. Eleanor read the letterhead twice, as though a second look might change what it said, and found herself recalculating everything she thought she understood about the man standing across the table from her. Preston tried to interject, suggesting the document could easily be forged, but the company's own attorney had already confirmed its authenticity through a call placed directly to the fund's legal office. Lenora Pembroke herself appeared moments later over a video call to confirm every detail personally, making clear that Drake had no need whatsoever to flaunt wealth he didn't have. He had spent the past several years developing a next-generation diagnostic platform capable of catching sensor failures long before they ever reached a pilot's display. The Orion 900 remained the only aircraft in existence that still carried the original experimental architecture required to prove the technology worked. The second reversal of the day settled over the room like a change in air pressure. The man they had assumed was chasing a fantasy purchase was in reality an inventor trying to reclaim the very laboratory he had built with his own hands. Lenora added almost as an aside that several other airlines had already expressed interest in licensing Drake's platform, and that Atherton Air could become the very first customer, assuming the company survived the week. Preston could feel authority slipping through his fingers. In a quiet, desperate move, he ordered the secondary maintenance server wiped, the one storing the original purchase contracts for the sensor batch now under suspicion. Malene caught the deletion process underway and managed to cut power before it finished. While Drake worked to rebuild the corrupted archive, Malene combed through years of purchase orders on a separate terminal, cross-referencing shipment dates against maintenance logs until a pattern began to surface that no single document could have revealed on its own. She noticed that the substitution had never appeared in any formal procurement request, but instead arrived buried inside a routine supplier renewal that almost nobody outside the finance department would ever have reason to open. Every invoice had been worded carefully enough to avoid triggering the usual safety review. A level of precision that told her this was no accident but a decision made by someone who understood exactly which alarms needed to stay silent. Drake recovered a partial archive from the wreckage of that attempt, and the recovered file showed that the certified sensors originally specified for the fleet had been quietly swapped for a cheaper alternative from a supplier that had never completed full certification. The savings from that substitution came out to exactly $11 million, the same figure Preston had proudly reported to the board months earlier as a triumph of operational efficiency. Preston insisted the substitution had cleared finance department review, but Drake traced a series of suspicious transfers leading to a consulting firm owned by Preston's own brother. Before Drake could open the remaining files, the power inside the hangar cut out without warning, and the prototype system began an emergency memory wipe that would erase everything if it wasn't stopped in time. Emergency lighting flickered on along the hangar ceiling, casting the entire floor in a dim amber glow that made the parked aircraft look like sleeping animals rather than machines. Somewhere near the loading doors, a technician shouted for someone to check the main breaker panel. Maline's radio crackled with 3 different voices at once, each reporting a different piece of the outage, and she had to raise her own voice above the noise just to be heard across the room. Eleanor stood frozen near the operations desk, watching a countdown timer appear on the nearest monitor, the kind of number that made even seasoned executives forget every rehearsed line they had ever used in a crisis meeting. The backup power supply could sustain the system for only 12 minutes. If the prototype module lost its data before that window closed, Atherton Air would have no reliable way to determine exactly which aircraft still carried the faulty sensors. Preston claimed the outage was simple coincidence, but Maline quickly traced the shutdown command back to his own administrative terminal. He tried to leave the operations center entirely, only to be stopped by internal security acting on Arthur Lockwood's direct order. Drake wasted no time arguing the point further, and instead climbed into the cramped technical bay of the Orion 900 to wire the prototype module directly into a portable power source. Eleanor stood outside the hatch and for the first time watched him work up close. The man she had once dismissed as penniless clearly understood every wire, every circuit board, and every sound coming from that aircraft better than her entire technical staff combined. Drake recovered the database just in time, only to discover that another passenger flight had been cleared for takeoff moments before the grounding order officially took effect. That aircraft was heading directly into a stretch of cold air, precisely the condition most likely to trigger the same synchronization failure that had grounded the others. The cockpit voice recording later showed just how calm the crew remained, even as warning tones layered over one another on their instrument panel. A calm that owed a great deal to the steady, unhurried instructions coming through their headsets from the ground. Drake spoke the way he always did, without drama, walking the first officer step by step through a checklist he had essentially written himself years earlier, back when he never imagined it would save lives under circumstances quite like these. Somewhere below the clouds, passengers who had no idea anything was wrong continued reading magazines and sipping coffee, entirely unaware of how close the flight had come to becoming a very different kind of story. Maline reached the flight crew immediately, and Drake talked them through isolating the newer sensors, cross-referencing readings from the older mechanical backups, and diverting safely to an alternate airfield. Preston tried once more to sow doubt, claiming Drake's instructions had never been formally approved by the company. Eleanor found herself choosing between corporate procedure and the man she had humiliated only hours earlier. After a long pause, she gave him full technical authority in front of the entire operations center. The flight landed without incident. The crisis was far from finished, though, since aviation regulators now required proof that the rest of the fleet carried no additional faulty sensors before flight operations could fully resume. Inspecting every aircraft individually threatened to take weeks, plenty of time for the company to collapse under the financial strain. Drake built a rapid diagnostic scan using the recovered prototype data, sorting the fleet quickly into aircraft that were clearly safe and aircraft that still needed replacement parts. Within 6 hours, his team had identified 14 affected aircraft with certainty, clearing the way for the rest of the fleet to return to service pending independent verification. Part 3, The Reckoning. Once the immediate danger had passed, the recovered system pulled up one more file. An audio recording from a maintenance meeting held 6 months earlier. In the recording, Preston clearly states that the sensor batch had failed to meet required standards. A second voice on the recording orders him to proceed with installation anyway, insisting that nothing could be allowed to disrupt the upcoming public offering. That second voice did not belong to Preston at all. It belonged to Arthur Lockwood, chairman of the board. Arthur denied it immediately, but the timestamp and the meeting schedule matched perfectly, leaving little room for doubt. He admitted to pressuring Preston over rising costs, but insisted he had no idea the sensors themselves posed any danger. Preston fired back that Arthur understood every warning that had ever crossed his desk, and the two men began openly blaming each other in front of the assembled board. Eleanor realized slowly and painfully that the people she had trusted most had used her name and her signature to bury a decision that had nearly cost dozens of lives. Drake refused to let Eleanor cast herself purely as a victim in the story. He reminded her that a culture built entirely around profit, appearances, and status was exactly what had allowed Preston and Arthur to act the way they had for months without consequence. She had laughed at a man delivering a warning simply because his clothes did not match the room he walked into. Eleanor wanted the entire affair kept quiet until after the public offering closed, but Drake made clear he would withhold the full diagnostic platform unless the company disclosed the root cause openly to its employees, its regulators, and its passengers. Arthur threatened legal action, accusing Drake of interfering with private business decisions that were none of his concern. Lenora Pembroke responded that her fund already had legal teams standing by and was fully prepared to acquire Atherton's assets outright should the company fail. The third reversal of the story landed there, quiet but absolute. The man who had been thrown out of the hangar that morning now had a financial partner powerful enough to rescue the airline, buy its assets, or simply let the empire fall apart on its own. Word of the recording spread through the building faster than any official memo could have managed. By the time the board reconvened in the main conference room, assistants outside the door were already fielding calls from reporters who had somehow heard fragments of what had happened. Arthur tried once more to frame the entire affair as an overreaction, insisting that cost discipline was simply part of running a company preparing to go public. But nobody in the room seemed willing to meet his eyes anymore. Eleanor sat at the head of the table without her usual composure, her hands folded tightly in front of her, listening to men she had trusted for years attempt to talk their way out of a disaster they had quietly built together. The board called an emergency vote before the day was out. Arthur was suspended from his position. Preston was removed as Chief Operating Officer and his files handed directly to investigators. Eleanor was asked to step back from daily operations while an independent review examined her own accountability in the matter. Before leaving the room, she turned to Drake and asked how much money it would take to keep him quiet and keep him working for the company going forward. Drake told her that question was exactly why her airline had nearly collapsed in the first place, because she still believed everything could simply be bought. He said he had no interest in being paid to stay silent. What he wanted instead was for the truth to be told plainly without spin and without delay. He set the final terms of any further cooperation on the table in front of her. The board needed Drake's diagnostic platform licensed properly if the fleet was ever going to resume full operations, and he agreed under 3 final conditions. Atherton Air would publicly disclose every maintenance failure connected to the crisis in full without exception. The company would establish an independent safety division reporting to no one but Malene Torres. The Orion 900 would be sold to him at its original assessed value, stripped of the family crest and free of any lingering control clauses. The board accepted every term without further debate. Eleanor signed the sale agreement for the aircraft at the very same table where she had once thrown his paperwork back across the room unread. Drake offered no celebration and no mockery of his own. He simply reviewed each page carefully and signed his name where required. Eleanor finally asked why he hadn't demanded the aircraft for nothing at all given everything she had put him through that day. Drake answered that he had come to buy the plane fairly and that her failure to see him clearly did not give him permission to become someone like her in return. The remark left her without a response. Within hours, the company released an official statement detailing everything that had gone wrong. Although its market value dropped sharply in the aftermath, the airline avoided a full grounding order specifically because it had chosen transparency over concealment. Malene stepped into emergency operational control, and thousands of employees kept their jobs because Drake had refused to use the crisis as a weapon against the company itself. When the Orion 900 was finally towed out of the Atherton hangar days later, workers removed the family crest from its fuselage panel by panel. Eleanor watched from behind a pane of glass as the aircraft that had once symbolized her family's power rolled away under the name of a man she had once told in front of a room full of strangers that he could not afford so much as one of its doors. Part 4, Aftermath. 6 months later, Drake had converted the Orion 900 into the first flying laboratory for a new company called Sullivan Aviation Safety. His diagnostic technology was already under contract with several airlines eager to avoid a crisis like the one that had nearly ended Atherton Air. Lenora Pembroke stayed on as a strategic investor but left every technical decision entirely in Drake's hands, trusting the judgment that had already proven itself under the worst possible pressure. The months that followed were neither dramatic nor easy, filled instead with the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust one procedure at a time. Employees who had spent the crisis bracing for layoffs found themselves instead sitting through new training sessions built around transparency rather than blame. Sessions that Millionaire insisted on attending personally so that nobody could claim the new standards applied only to people below a certain rank. Regulators conducted a lengthy review of the airline's practices and ultimately allowed it to keep flying, citing the company's full cooperation and its willingness to expose failures that many competitors might have preferred to bury. Investors who had once cared only about the stock offering found themselves, somewhat to their own surprise, more reassured by the airline's honesty than they ever would have been by a flawless unveiling that hid a ticking problem underneath it. Atherton Air rebuilt itself slowly under new leadership, with every financial decision now required to pass through an independent safety review before moving forward. Millionaire Torres was named interim chief executive, and under her direction, the company adopted a standard that no cost-saving measure could ever again bypass a documented safety concern. Investigators combed through years of contracts and correspondence, uncovering additional instances where corners had been cut quietly enough to avoid notice, each new finding chipping away further at the reputations both men had spent decades constructing. Former colleagues who once sought their approval in meetings now declined to return their calls, and the consulting firm connected to Preston's brother quietly shut its doors within the year. Preston and Arthur both faced ongoing financial and professional investigations that would take years to resolve, their reputations permanently altered by choices made in the name of a stock offering that never fully recovered its original promise. The resignation letter Eleanor eventually signed was shorter than she expected it to be, only a few paragraphs, nothing like the carefully worded statements her family's public relations